And it looks like we are live. Excellent. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so, just to let the folks that are coming in a little late trickle in. So I guess we'll need to make some cybersecurity jokes. Tucker, do you know any good cybersecurity jokes?
Oh, I'm not sure I do. I'll leave that to you, Scott.
I have one. I have one cybersecurity joke that makes me laugh. It's not a good joke. Forewarning, terrible joke, but I'm going to tell it anyway because we need to kill some time. What did the asset management system say to the vulnerability scanner?
I don't know.
Nothing.
Nice.
Yes, good stuff. Have to keep it good. That's how we do our icebreakers here at Nucleus.
All right, I got one back for you.
All right, I'm ready.
What do you call a turtle that surfs the dark web?
Turtle is, I don't know.
A tortoise.
Oh, geez. Should have known. I was, for whatever reason, I was thinking like dark turtle slash Bowser. Whatever reason, I wanted to say Bowser. So that's
Got
a good
you with the pun.
Actually, we should probably. I would be Patrick. You should do a poll. You should see which joke was best. But with that, I think we can start kicking off. Thank you everybody for coming to our webinar. It's a webinar with me and Tucker. So I'm here representing Nucleus, and on my co-patriot over here is Tucker, who works at Deloitte, and we have been working together for a while now, and we have very strong opinions around where the cybersecurity industry should be going in relation to attack surface management versus vulnerability management and things like that. And so we thought it was compelling enough to, and more importantly, Deloitte's legal team thought it was compelling enough for us to be able to have this conversation for you all so that we can start talking about how to take risk-based approaches to assessing attack surface. And so that's what we're going to cover today. And just to say hello, my name is Scott Kuffer, and Tucker, why don't you introduce yourself real quick?
Hello, everyone. Tucker Pettis. As Scott said, I'm work with Deloitte. I'm a senior manager. I lead our attack surface management practice.
Awesome. Just the man that we want to talk to. Now, I always like to start these things with what are we going to talk about, just so that you all can understand if this is worth your time. And if not, we can duck out quick. And if Tucker or I decide it's not worth our time, we could just say hello and goodbye, which, great for everybody. But we already did the introduction, so awesome news. We're already part of the way done. Look at that. So much progress. We're going to be talking about attack surface management, how it differs from vulnerability management. We're going to be talking about all of these different call them like acronyms for TVM versus TRM versus TVM versus RBVM, and kind of what that means and how that all fits into the future of the ASM picture. We're going to talk about some of the trends that we're seeing in the marketplace and make some predictions around where we think the market is going. And then we're going to be starting to talk about where is risk-based vulnerability management in its maturity journey and those types of things. And then we'll talk through a couple quick use cases like prioritization and whatnot. So let's get this thing going. And first and foremost, I apologize for the awful picture, but we have to do the eye candy shot just so that everybody understands who we're talking to. My name is Scott Kuffer, as I mentioned. I'm actually one of the co-founders of Nucleus Security. We're a vulnerability aggregation system, an RBVM tool that fits into a larger ASM picture and strategy. And we aggregate all of your vulnerability, asset, and threat intel information into a single location, and then allow you to build business logic, automation, and reporting and all of that on top of a single normalized data set. So that's the reason I'm here, is my background is federal government, DoD, large complex organizations, and implementing vulnerability programs within those. And that's why you get to see my wonderful face as part of this webinar. And we've got Tucker over here as well. I don't know, do you want to go into any more detail around what you do over at Deloitte, Tucker?
Yeah, I can give a quick little blurb here. So, I started my career as a pen tester years back. So spent a lot of time breaking things, and then decided to come over to the good guys and figure out how to prevent people from breaking in. And so I've been with Deloitte for about 5 years now. And really what we focus on and what I focus on is helping organizations, some of our largest, Fortune 100, Fortune 500 clients, building, maturing, focusing on attack surface management. And we'll get into what that means in a little bit here, but how do we better reduce risk across kind of all of our security domains as it relates to vulnerabilities. And so that kind of ties directly into why we've been working with Scott and Nucleus here.
Excellent. So with that, let's start talking about the basics, right? We're going to start at the basics, and then we're going to start to dissect the more interesting stuff. So first and foremost, we want to talk about attack surface management and what is it, right? Because when I remember when ASM, the idea first came out a few years ago, everybody was thinking about like the security scorecards of the world, right? Hey, we're going to scrape the internet and we're going to do third-party risk assessments on public-facing information. And then you try to correlate that with vulnerability data. And so there's a ton of confusion where nobody's really consistent around how we talk about ASM versus vulnerability management. So Tucker, from your experience running the ASM program and practice over at Deloitte, how do you guys see attack surface management and where it fits into the larger picture of VM and all those types of other things?
Yeah, and Scott, we kind of had a similar journey at Deloitte, going from threat and vulnerability management to attack surface management. One of the things that we actually had to do in Deloitte is rebuild our entire VM program from the ground up. So if we look at the scope of Deloitte, we're in 50 plus countries, hundreds of thousands of assets, and we had to really take a look at what our vulnerability landscape looked like. And so some of the things that you see here, vulnerability management, patch management, endpoint, secure config, those are all components of a larger attack surface management program. And that's just a few things. We also want to look at application security, OT and IoT, firewall and network security, as well as the perimeter, what you were just talking about, Scott. How do we do that external reconnaissance to really understand what our attack surface is? And so that journey from vulnerability management to attack surface management was really important because vulnerability management was really siloed, really focused on running vulnerability scans on your core infrastructure, putting out reports to IT teams to go patch something. In reality, what we know from years of experience is that works to some degree, but doesn't actually take in it's not very effective at reducing risk, and we need to take a holistic approach to risk reduction. And so I kind of take attack surface and management into two parts. One part is the attack surface that we were just talking about, and that includes everything from infrastructure, cloud, external, internal applications, all of those things, really bringing a holistic look at ASM. And then really what the biggest transition has been is in the management piece. It's not just about patching, because we can't patch everything. Our IT teams can't keep up with the influx of patches that are coming in. And so how do we prioritize? How do we manage? And how do we do other things to mitigate risk beyond just patch management? And so that's really where we've taken that. And then the next piece with the management is, how do we take that data that we do have, that prioritized key remediation, risk reduction data, and get it to the teams that can actually do something about it? The old days of downloading a spreadsheet full of CVEs and throwing them over the wall, via email to your patch teams, like that doesn't work. And so that's where we see tools like risk-based vulnerability management tools really being effective in bringing that holistic attack surface management piece together. So that's kind of our view of attack surface management. Scott, you want to talk a little bit how you see Nucleus fitting into that ASM world?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Tucker was starting to, kind of hint around, is that, attack surface management has to do with the management of all of the data that you do have in order to turn that into action. So back when when I was working in federal government, it was this same concept around, hey, you have all this information, right? Let's think about the intelligence community as an example, right? My main job in the intelligence community is to make good decisions at scale across an entire, nation's attack surface, right? And so when you translate that same type of concept into a vulnerability program or an attack surface management program, Nucleus is a similar type of concept, right? So RBVM in general, the purpose of RBVM is not just about, say, like prioritization or just about individual use cases. It's thinking about it at a higher level, right? So we have all of this data. That data is massive, right? If you think about just the number of vulnerabilities that most organizations have, I mean, the average I think that we've seen is around 128 to 150 vulnerabilities per asset inside of an organization. And so when you start to scale that out to, and that's just devices, by the way, that's not, servers and applications and all of those things. So when you start to scale that out to hundreds of thousands or millions of assets, it becomes a huge problem in just how to manage the results of all of this data. So we view at Nucleus, the biggest problem with ASM is not generating the data. It's actually how do you manage the data once it's been created. And when you look at best practices in the industry, I think when I started, we were trying to figure out how to do quarterly scanning, right? And quarterly scanning is just, it's not good enough for organizations to be able to do what they need to do, right? Like most compliance frameworks that we're starting to see from the Fed come down are continuous monitoring related. And so how do you do continuous monitoring other than you just generate a massive amount of data very quickly every single day or every single minute of the day? So with that, I think that's a great segue actually into where we see RBVM fitting into the ASM process as well. Now, I'm going to let Tucker talk through all of this, but the little blue box is where we view Nucleus. And that's the integration of all of these disparate sources, right? So we integrate with things like CMDB or asset discovery tools or traditional ASM, things like the security scorecards and those types of things, or even like asset note, bit discovery, those types of things. We combine all of that together so you get an internal and an external view. You can put that all together. It's enriched with all the information that you have in your organization to make decisions. Things like how do we think about vulnerabilities and the attributes of those vulnerabilities based on asset ownership? How do we put all that together, glue it all together like a little neural brain for your VM program, and then push that out to remediation actions, and so that the right data gets to the right people. And so we view RBVM as the glue that kind of holds the ASM program together, but no more important or less important than all of the other components as well. You need all of these components functioning at a high degree to be able to get an effective ASM program. Because if you have no data, you have nothing to actually make decisions on, as an example. I don't know how you feel about that, Tucker, or you want to talk through anything additional on that?
Yeah, I can kind of talk through this slide a little bit, but also, one of the points that you mentioned was around that there is no shortage of data, right? I mean, if we just look at the top middle piece of IT, OT, IoT, all of these different scanners that you're getting from your Qualys or your Tenable, your Red Hat, or sorry, your Rapid7, all of your pen testing, bug bounty, OT monitoring, passive, net vulnerability detection, all of those things are bringing in so much data. And that's still really the core of what an ASM program is, right? We need all of that data. But really what's next, as Scott mentioned, is taking that and putting it into a platform where, one, you can get all the data in one place from all your different tools. You can correlate and analyze it together to really bring in, risk reduction and prioritize risk reduction. And the rest of this slide, if we look at, kind of starting on the left side, these are a lot of the inputs, kind of the foundation of what ASM is. You need your privileged access management so you can have your scan credentials to make sure you're actually getting all the vulnerabilities across your entire network. Attack surface monitoring, all of your external reconnaissance data. Asset management, as Scott mentioned, we can't protect what we don't know. And then the application security piece. And we can talk about why that's a dotted line down to the bottom later, but in some ways, application security has a whole different set of processes and tools that vulnerability management is today. And then the right side is what I was talking about with the management side. We've taken in all this data, we've organized it, we've reported on it, and what do we do next? We go remediate, or we reduce risk, or we send it to our security operations center so they can identify what the most important things to monitor or look for are. And if we look at this diagram as a whole, there are things missing here. This is not a complete diagram, and there's probably more arrows that go across the whole thing. But for simplicity of a webinar, wanted to bring in some of the core elements that we look at for a mature ASM program, and with RBVM in the middle being that kind of orchestration piece so that we can actually accomplish all the things that we're looking at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's funny because I know when you look at even just the charts and the diagrams, it can get really overwhelming pretty quickly. And when you start trying to put that all together across, I don't even think we have OT and we don't even necessarily have IoT and OT in this diagram either, right? So this is only capturing kind of the core of what people are struggling with. And I know, like, at least from my perspective, I think everybody gets really into the idea of, hey, we can start automating this for, data and for, I hear a lot attack paths and things like that. And it's like, that's all awesome. I would love to get to that point. And I think we can get to that point as an industry. but it seems like we're struggling really a big time with the basics and the foundational elements of this. Like, I'd be curious to know how many folks actually feel very confident in their risk reduction strategy within ASM and vulnerability management today for just the basics of servers and critical infrastructure. And then if you start putting that out like above layers of the onion, like like with workstations and then your SCADA systems and all of those, how we would start to feel. And so when you start putting it into those perspectives, attack path and all that stuff is awesome, but it's what we consider an advanced use case when most folks are struggling with just the basics. And so my goal here is hopefully that we can reiterate the importance of the basics.
Yeah, and Scott, one of those things that when we look at like the future of automation, you're right, most organizations aren't even there yet. The two biggest questions that we still get today is, I have a big backlog of vulnerabilities. How do I reduce it, right? I'm getting in more data than I can handle. And secondly, it's the standard, what do I do next question. Like that's kind of the continual panic that we get. It's the data overload from all of these things. And so something like Nucleus and our BVM really, it answers that question of what do I do next and how do I prioritize, take this big chunk of hundreds of thousands, or even for some organizations, hundreds of millions of vulnerabilities from their different systems, and break it down into actionable chunks of data and getting that to the teams who can do something with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the big things that we see is it's great to have a prioritized list at the global level, but if each individual team who's responsible for fixing vulnerabilities, which is not the vulnerability teams, but in most cases, generally nothing happens anyway, right? And so we're starting to see a lot of different avenues that organizations are trying to use to fix this, but I think we'll cover most of that later in some of these questions here in a minute. So with that, I'd like to turn it to sort of what we think of as the timeline of RBVM and risk-based vulnerability management. And so first and foremost, Tucker, from your perspective, I'd like to understand if you see a difference between VM versus TVM versus RBVM. Let's start there, and then we'll there.
Yeah, so I think the hardest one there is VM versus is TVM there. And so, vulnerability management obviously being the catch-all for all of these things, a general term for taking in, identifying vulnerabilities and doing something with it. TVM is kind of the next step here of bringing in that threat level data. What is, making each of that a little bit more actionable. And then the next step being risk-based vulnerability management, where it's not just contextualizing the data, but it's contextualizing, automating, organizing, and really doing something with it rather than just saying, this vulnerability is more important than the other, slicing and dicing, what you were just saying about not just at the global level, but at the, level of the IT teams or the business units that are going to do the actual remediation.
Yeah, I think that's the pattern that we're seeing as well. And I like this slide from a timeline perspective because it shows the winding road of where we've gone with vulnerability management over the years. And I will say, like, just from a contextual perspective, to put this in perspective from what we see, is I think of Generation Zero in the early 2000s as, that was before we even had network scanners, right? I don't know if you all remember, we started out with host-based scanning, right? You had to put an agent on everything and it would sort of push data up to a central location. Then when Nessus and Qualys and Rapid7 came out and it was network-based scanning, everybody was like, their minds were blown and it was all exciting because you didn't have to do all this agent management. And then now with the increase of cloud and distributed systems and networks, we're kind of going back to agent-based scanning. And so it's kind of funny from just a pure scanning perspective, but the data management, if you look at the data management of all of these through the years, has stayed pretty static in how it gets responded to. So like pre-analytics, we would generate a big old JSON. Actually, before that, it was only XML. We would generate a big old XML file and have people manually look through it. Then it was, hey, we actually figured out we can turn this into spreadsheets. And it's been spreadsheets basically ever since. And our joke, at least at Nucleus, is that no matter how much money you spend on vulnerability management processes, could be $1 million, could be $50 million, you're still going to be using Excel as the main driver of action. So it's a joke where you kind of laugh and you also kind of don't laugh at the same time. But we view ourselves as generation 2 right now. Like where we're at today is what we call widening the aperture. So if you look at the centralized analytics generation 1 in the 2010s, this is where we view tools like Kenna and Brinka in this generation of systems, where there was the idea that, hey, we can start aggregating data together. The issue is that they were thinking about it in the context of the early days of vulnerability management, very network centric, very network based. And so when you look at some of the things that are happening, it was CVE based as an example, whereas like with the modern infrastructure, you need to be thinking bigger than just patching. You need to be thinking about your holistic risk management. Not to say that those tools can't do that. It's just sort of where they came to fruition and came to their sort of teenage years in that time. And so we view that as sort of the generation they're a part of. And what we're starting to see is a push towards the future and modernization. And everybody's pushing towards that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things when we looked at Gen 1 that made such a huge leap in what changed the conversation, both at the executive level and kind of at the engineering level, was that move from vulnerability counts to risk-based. And it's really was an important distinction because, and we're still, a lot of organizations are still moving on that journey, but we getting away from looking at these big counts of vulnerabilities, 100,000, 100 million, whatever that means. How do you contextualize that? And what does that actually mean? If I have 1 million vulnerabilities, is that good? Is that bad? I mean, who knows? And so moving from that to a risk score and a risk-based approach, obviously why we're here today. And it was really powerful what they did to set that stage. And as Scott mentioned, as we move forward, what do we do with that next? And looking beyond just CVEs and CVSS scores into what is the next iteration of risk-based vulnerability management and mature ASM.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that it's a very exciting time in the VM space, which I don't know if that's ever really happened, to be honest. Like sometimes when I used to tell people I was in VM, you'd be like, "Is your mom proud of that?"
What virtual machine are you using, Scott?
That's right. We're making our parents proud now. This is the new generation here. So where we see it going, though, right, is what leading organizations that we work with are doing. There are some patterns, right? Like, I've obviously at Nucleus, we work with a bunch of customers. Obviously at Deloitte, Tucker works with a ton of customers. And we're starting to see some real patterns emerge around. For me, it's not about just the theory of these things, right? Theories are great. I think vulnerability programs, there's tons of theories out there, right? There's the SysACEV list, there's threat intel lists, there's EPSS scores, there's vulnerability risk scores from each of these scanners. And all of these things are awesome. The problem is that they're all rooted in theory, and the hard part is actually getting things implemented. So like when I look at why CVSS is so widely used, it's just because it's easy. Right? It just is. It's the easiest thing. It's why like CVSS on its own is actually not a bad algorithmic scoring system if you used all of it, right? But the vast majority of organizations, they look at the base score and that's it. And then they move on with their day because it's easy. And so when we're seeing real change happening in organizations to make substantive leaps forward, we see this broken down into 6 categories. And the first one is, how do you organize as a business to be able to effectively manage all of the data? So Tucker, I don't know, what are some of the patterns you're seeing with really organizations that are like cutting edge?
Well, I'm actually going to interrupt your flow real quick because you talked about EPSS and CISA-KEV, and there's a question in there about Nucleus supporting those. So since you already hit on them, you want to spend a few seconds talking about that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So with Nucleus as a platform, we absolutely will support things like EPSS, CISA-KEV, and all of those. Those are just additional enrichment feeds into a larger vulnerability attribution, right? So if I have a vulnerability, it's discovered by Nessus, or maybe I have that same vulnerability discovered by Nessus and Qualys and whatever. You have the external threat view of that vulnerability, which is the Mandiants of the world. EPSS is based on exploitation and predictive exploitation. CISA-KEV is all based around what's happening out there in the ether. And so you have that external view, which you need as one of your pieces of subscore. You have to actually have your seed data, which is provided by those scanners. And then you also have to have the internal business context. So where Nucleus excels as a platform, shameless plug, is we put all 3 of those together so that you have all of those to make the best decision, and then you can automate off of that. So in the model for Nucleus and RBVM, you absolutely can use those. And I would say that in the Deloitte model for ASM, it's encouraged to use additional exploitation information like that in your ASM solution, regardless of whether you have a tool like Nucleus to assist with that or not.
Well, thanks. So going back to org chart, I think this is maybe the one on here that is the hardest to kind of figure out where things are going. We've seen a bunch of different organizations moving in different directions on this because, I mean, traditionally or now in most organizations, you have a cloud security team, you have your VM team, your endpoint team, firewall, network security, all of those, and they're often very siloed. I think some of what we're seeing as we get into some of these tools that are bridging the gap between those teams more, that we're getting more, they're moving together in some ways, that you have less separation across those different silos. And especially as we look at things like cloud versus infrastructure teams. From a security perspective, yes, there's different technologies and things like that for cloud versus infrastructure, but a lot of the processes and principles of ASM apply across all of that. So moving away from separating your cloud as a whole different security strategy, it needs to be, part of your defense in depth. We've seen some organizations that look at their security from a production versus pre-production standpoint, where you have organizations really focused on external attack surface of all forms, not just vulnerabilities, but everything, defense in depth from external versus your pre-production internal SDLC processes. So, and I'm not saying that's where the trend's going, but I think that was a, kind of interesting approach to, looking at how we maneuver our teams to be more efficient and less siloed.
Yeah, I think we're seeing something similar, but to be like very, I mean, in my case, I'll stick two stakes in the ground where I see the organizations going, right? On the one hand, I see a lot of organizations, especially large, complex organizations, essentially stand up some sort of security services team at a global level for global governance. And then they are the ones where they're consolidating all of the scanning schedules into that one central location. And then each part of the business is essentially requesting MSSP services from that central place. That's something that we're seeing pretty consistently in large, complex organizations, rather than every team managing their own scanning, specifically on the network side. And we do see that. I'm not going to opine on whether that's the best or the worst way to do it. This is what we're seeing. But equally as much, what we're seeing is something that I call the democratization of the vulnerability process, right? So in the context of agile company structures and agile development workflows, where developers own the infrastructure and the products and everything in bundles, we're starting to see that across organizations as a whole. So it's not just in development where we're seeing that. We're seeing that across the board where, hey, we have a project or we have an business outcome. Let's organize a cross-functional team around that. And what we're seeing is that some organizations that are successful are forcing those cross-functional teams to own the vulnerabilities in their stack, right? Because the team that is the VM team is not able to actually fix them in most cases. So how do you scale VM across an entire organization? And so what we're seeing is that if you treat vulnerability management in an agile style process and sort of embedding it within the teams, that's the other way that we're seeing the organization structure around this. And I know we don't want to spend too long on all of this stuff, so I'm gonna stop there. But I'm seeing two very clear but different paths depending on the organization. Now, I don't know if you want to talk about tech and compliance, Tucker.
Yeah, well, I was actually going to combine tech and automation because I think in some ways those are going in the same direction. Although specifically with technology, one of the I don't know if it's a trend, but we're seeing is, the only thing more common than a new vulnerability scanning tool out there is like a new altcoin, right? I mean, there's a new tool every day for different types of vulnerability scanning, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And one of the things that we're identifying is because part of that is because there is not one good way to scan everything. You need a different way to scan your OT environments versus your core infrastructure versus your ephemeral cloud infrastructure, right? And so bringing all that together, I think we're seeing this big, all right, there's 100 different tools out there. And now we're seeing more of a consolidation again, where you're getting more platforms that are doing more things, and there's good and bad to both, right? Because we don't want to be, we see some tools out there that are kind of the jack of all trades, master of none, right? They do every security thing in the world, but they're not the best out of it. And that might be a good thing from a, tool consolidation standpoint, but maybe not as good from a security standpoint. But really what I think that takes it into, and some of that consolidation, is where do we automate? And it doesn't really matter how many tools we have, as long as we can actually take all of that data and do something with it. And so some of the things that we're excited about in ASM are moving beyond traditional remediation for risk reduction. It's not just patching, but how can we take things like next generation firewalls or SOAR platforms and automation, things like that, to reduce risk or eliminate connections or things like that, so that we can reduce risk in real time rather than waiting for a 30-day or 90-day patch cycle to eliminate a vulnerability. So I think that's kind of the next generation of technology and automation.
That's great. I don't have really anything of substance to add. I really have to know, did the term next generation firewall just slip off the tongue there?
It's better than NGFW or whatever. I see the acronym all the time, but don't actually say it that much.
I still get little shivers when I hear next generation anything.
Well, it's either that or SASE. So if we want to throw out the term of the day, and zero trust too.
That's right. Yeah, video cards, everybody will love it.
yeah, that's right. I think that the next big, I kind of hit on remediation there too, but thoughts on how you're seeing compliance and regulation as it relates to Nucleus?
Absolutely. It's regulation and compliance is actually the place that we're seeing probably the most change. And I would say it's probably the most exciting part of the VM space right now, where we are talking about the federal government has, and actually I did a talk on this not too long ago about how the federal government is almost the ideal partner to push these types of changes in vulnerability management, because the incentives of vulnerability management are just absolutely contradictory in many ways to the incentives of business. And so the investments that are required to build regulatory frameworks in vulnerability management, it seems unlikely that that's going to be pushed by the private sector. So what we're seeing is that there's a clear trend towards, CISA and some of the agencies and the executive branch and all of the budget. They just signed an executive order recently to increase cybersecurity budgets for federal agencies again. And there's different programs. Some folks may have heard of it. It's called CMMC. It's still out there on whether or not it's going to take off. But the idea is that in order to do business with the federal government, you're going to be required to meet certain cybersecurity requirements. And vulnerability management is starting to become a huge part of that. So you look at CISA BOD 22-01, which is also known as the CISA KEV list. So anybody that has a federal contract, any parts of those systems are actually required, they're bound contractually in order to respond to vulnerabilities on the KEV list within that time period of the due date set in the KEV list. And that's just one example. We saw CISA, not CISA KEV, the CISA BOD 23-01 around continuous monitoring and continuous asset discovery. So we view it over the next few years to continue to push in this way. And we think it's only going to get more restrictive, not less restrictive. And so this is a problem that's coming to face all of us, whether we want it or not, because of the federal government. And so, it's exciting or not exciting, depending on who you are. But, as a federal government jockey back in the day, obviously a little compliance never hurt anybody.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that that's kind of loosely related is around the insurance industry. We're seeing a lot of organizations focusing their remediation and compliance around insurance qualifications, right? And it's an interesting balance, because I've seen, most of the insurance orgs I've seen use things like security scorecard or similar tools to use that rating as the basis for their insurance premiums. And one of the frustrating things about that is, security scorecard only sees a small slice of what the actual, vulnerability and risk landscape looks like, right? And so we had one organization who was really focused on bringing their security scorecard score up. And it was focused on some what we would have deemed really minor issues compared to some of the broader things that they were seeing in their vulnerability management program. So I think balancing real risk reduction versus insurance and compliance requirements is going to be an interesting battle over the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, there's only one more point on this. I know, like, I try not to talk about compliance as much as possible, but there was a question from Ted on LinkedIn Live. Hello, everybody on LinkedIn Live, about supply chain. So federal government's actually pushing really big in this area too. There's a whole initiative around SBOM, software bill of materials, that most organizations have probably heard of at this point. We view that as something that is going to be forced upon everybody going forward as well. And so we view vendor risk and upstream vendor risk is going to be the responsibility of the organizations that are providing that business service. So if I rely on, I don't want to call out any vendors. So if I rely on an upstream vendor, you know, maybe one that does word processing software as an example, if there are issues in the word processing software that I use, then I actually will take responsibility for if I get attacked or breached because of that. So we're starting to see regulations come out in that regard. And I think organizations are going to probably adopt that faster than the actual basics of vulnerability management processes, because that's something that is of a higher importance and a higher perceived risk in most organizations. So that's what kind of we're seeing as well. I don't know if you agree with that, Tucker, but that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
I don't think I was anything bad.
Cool. So let's jump in, because I know we're already 6 minutes past where we like to end these things, short, hard hitting segments, like I don't know, 30 minutes instead of 60 minutes. So now to talk through one of the use cases with RBVM and why it's so powerful inside of an attack surface management strategy and having all of the data from ASM in general. So for example, these are 2 screenshots from Nucleus. We're using Nucleus as the sort of driver of examples here, just because it was easy to take screenshots since I have a login. And what we're seeing is that at the top here is a list of all of the vulnerabilities inside of one of our, not one of our customers, but like a sample customer organization, right? So you'll see that in this particular example, we have 1.1 million instances of medium severity vulnerabilities, and you deduplicate that down to 25,000-ish unique vulnerabilities. And same thing with criticals, right? So that's just what we're getting from all of the different scanning tools. You can see one is from Microsoft, one is from CrowdStrike and things, right? When you apply the intelligence of all of the decision-making that you get through business context and threat intelligence, things like EPSS, et cetera, what ends up happening is that you narrow that down extremely quickly to the things that truly matter to your organization. And again, this is just one use case of how having all of this data in one central location is going to help you make decisions at an ASM level. So this is just the prioritization use case, but there's a whole bunch of others as well. But the idea is that we take the data that's up here in the top, we apply a risk rating based on what Mandiant is seeing in the wild. We see that it's being used by malware externally. We're looking at assets inside of Nucleus that are public facing. And just by those 3 attributes, we go from 175,000 down to 3 in the critical severity vulnerabilities. And we go from 1.1 million instances on medium severity down to nothing. And all of a sudden, it becomes really quick to just say, we know what we want to do in this case. You can make decisions and plans of actions and playbooks off of all these attributes strung together. And it could be anything, right? It could be business critical asset. It could be, hey, its EPSS score is above 90% and it's on a public facing asset. And we know that it's got secrets on it because it's the code repository that's for whatever banking system we use. All sorts of stuff that you can feed into it and come up with actions very quickly. And so that's the idea of RBVM inside of attack surface management and how we drive those types of remediation actions. Because you can do whatever you want with this data now that you have it, right? Yeah, I don't know, Tucker, do you agree with that?
One of the things that I would highlight that I think is a really, where we see some of the aha moment is that this becomes not just a security tool, right? This is something that IT teams can buy into, because instead of seeing that 4.6 thousand criticals, holy cow, how do I remediate that many? I've got uptime, I've got business requirements, I've got all that. Oh, only 2 things? Okay, let me knock that out real quick and we can move to the next thing, right? And so when you get this picture of ASM into, you get that buy-in across the different teams. It's I have it's kind of a lame saying, but that a successful attack surface management requires top-down and bottom-up support. The top-down is simple. You need leadership buy-in across security and IT to make this a priority. But the bottom-up support is really where we see a lot of the struggles, and where we don't get bottom-up support is the traditional throw the Excel sheet over the wall, go fix this. You get the buy-in, the bottom-up support from the engineers, from your IT teams, when they see something like this that's easily actionable, identifiable. Okay, I know what to do next. I know what's important. I'll go take care of it, right? And so that's, I think this use case really highlights that.
Absolutely. And yeah, one thing I feel like I am obliged to talk about morale, because it's way different of a conversation when you're communicating with engineers. When you say, hey, we have 3 things we need you to fix, and every month it's 3 to 5 to 10 things, as opposed to, hey, by the way, here's a million items, go figure it out. And so it's just, yeah, I can't understate the impact or overstate the impact. One of those, I can't state the impact incorrectly of what it means when it comes to morale of these teams. And that's why, I mean, I don't know about you, Tucker. I'm curious, what do you see from a turnover perspective in the VM space? Because historically, from what I've seen, it's a pretty short stint in a lot of places, because it's just very detrimental to your mental and physical well-being.
Well, yeah, and it's high, I don't know if it's high risk, but it's high importance and often low reward, right? I mean, part of the problem with vulnerability management is that VM teams in themselves don't do anything to reduce risk. A vulnerability management itself is really just an identification and reporting function. It really requires other teams to do something about it. So yeah, we do see a lot of burn, because some people get frustrated by running tenable scans over and over again and not seeing a lot of progress. And so the morale piece is really interesting, because one of the easy things that we see when we go into clients and have, hey, we're not making any progress on our vulnerability management program, and say, okay, well, who's the IT person that you work with? Oh, I don't know. I just email this guy. Well, where does he sit? I don't know. I've never met him. All right, well, maybe we should go find him. Let's just go over there. Let's build a relationship. Let's, teach them to use the tool that we're doing, because most IT people understand security inherently and want to be a part of the solution. They just have a million other priorities. And so kind of going back to this prioritization use case, you said, only 2 things or 3 things a month. Like, that's great. And what we found is that over time, when you say, oh, hey, it's only 2 things this month, and next month they come back like, okay, I did the 2 things. What's next? Like, what more can I do? And so you can kind of keep building on that. You're never going to get to the 4,000 a month, but you can get to the, 2, 3, 10, 20, where you're actually making a dent in that vulnerability backlog.
And they're the right ones too. So it's great. What I will say, I feel like I feel obliged now, obligated to actually do a shout out to one of my good friends, Robert Wood. He's the CISO over at CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. He and a few people that he know from the industry have started an initiative called the Soft Side of Cyber, where it's all about cybersecurity and how cybersecurity interacts with the rest of the business. And so if you're interested in those types of how you can ease some of those challenges in an organization, they're doing tons of cutting edge research around how to interact from VM to IT, being an embedded AppSec engineer inside of a development team. So if those are topics you're interested in, obviously feel free to reach out to Tucker or myself, and we can point you in the right direction there. But yeah, I think that's an often overlooked part of our industry that I just felt like we needed to call out here. So with that, since we're 15 minutes over time on what we were planning to do, what are our key takeaways, Tucker?
Well, I'll keep this really simple. I think we've hammered home that scanning is not enough. There's too much data. There's too many things to do. You have to have a way to take in all of this data and really make it actionable. And on top of that, mature ASM programs are really built on RBVM. This is really the core piece, as we've kind of hammered home for the last 45 minutes around, mature ASM. And lastly, if you need anything, reach out to Scott.
Me? Oh, I think you can reach out to both of us.
That's right.
CC Tucker. You can reach out to me, but you have to CC Tucker. That's the requirement there. I will say, Tucker, just about this topic, I know we have tons of tangential topics that you and I always do around different talks and things. I know Nucleus, we have a talk coming up about Nucleus Core, but one of the talks that we've done is how to think about vulnerability management and the practice of VM inside of a VM team, and how you can learn from agile development processes, and how vulnerability management and product management are very similar, and what lessons we can learn from our side. Do you have anything like that you guys are working on that you want people to check out?
I don't know if I have anything direct to point people to. I mean, one of the great things about Deloitte is that we are constantly developing new technologies, new processes, new ways to really enhance our clients' security posture. And so if you ever have any questions or really want to understand more about how, we look at mature cyber programs, please, reach out. And I think one of the things that's really interesting that I'll take 30 seconds on is, and I think someone in the chat mentioned it too, about really taking more of a agile and sec DevOps approach across security. One of the things that we look at application security today, nobody is developing code in production, right? Or I hope no one is. We have you develop locally, you push to pre-prod, to QA, test, and up through the ranks. That doesn't happen in IT a lot of the times. Most patching is just done in production in some way of, a ring methodology, or release management strategy that's just to reduce risk, but it doesn't involve real testing. And so one of the things that our ASM team is building is real patch automation built into something like Nucleus, where you're taking that prioritization, you're doing the testing, the smoke testing, working with the application teams to understand the requirements, so that when you push to production across your entire estate, you have some confidence that you're not going to break anything. So I think that's kind of one of the exciting things that we're moving towards.
Perfect. And I think that leaves us with Q&A, and there were a ton of these, so we're gonna have to talk through them. So I'm going to start with the LinkedIn Live ones, and then we'll go over to the other ones. All right. So we have Jonah from Tenable. Thanks for coming, Tenable. So the question was, luxury of resources is, okay, so VM teams and risk teams being split apart. That's actually something that we see a lot as well, right? So sometimes the risk teams will use tools like Archer, for example, a GRC platform to talk about the risk register. And the question was, does Nucleus ease the burden of how do I understand risk and get vulns to the system owners? Oh, this is very Nucleus specific. Okay, cool. So I guess that's me. I was prepping it for you, man. Okay, so to answer the question directly, yes, that's actually part of the purpose of Nucleus, is to be able to bring collaboration across all the different divisions and departments. So everybody needs access to essentially the same data, and they want access to the latest real-time data. Sometimes that's the GRC teams. Sometimes that's the vulnerability analyst team. Sometimes it's product owners and development teams. Sometimes it's patch management. And we bring all that together into a single spot so that anybody can go and, look at the data that they need, and it gets pushed to them in the way that they want. So to answer your question, Jonah, from LinkedIn Live, yes, that is absolutely something that we do. Tucker, looks like you answered Brian's question. There was another one around, where would Archer tie into the diagram?
That's an interesting one. So there's probably a lot of ways, because Archer does a lot of things, but the biggest one that we see is around exception management. So using Archer for your GRC platform and how you're managing risk exceptions, patch exceptions, things like that. We've seen some success in taking, hey, it's the classic, I can't patch this because it's going to break X, right? And so how do you track that risk over time? And there's a lot of ways to do it. Most organizations are using something like Archer for their GRC platform. The biggest challenge we see is, at what level are you tracking risk, and how do you report on it? Because tracking exceptions at the individual CVE and asset level can be very overwhelming and consuming. And so there are integrations with Archer that we've done to do that level of detail, but it's really depends on kind of how the risk and GRC org is structured at each company.
Right. So as an example, in the Nucleus context, we have an entire register of all your currently active vulnerabilities with states and statuses. And the idea is that you would be able to change the status of something in Nucleus to say, hey, we've requested an exception. And then that will go and trigger a workflow inside of something like an Archer to go to the risk team and say, risk team, hey, approval required. Can we accept the risk on this? And then it goes through the traditional risk management process from the risk teams, and it's all together, but it's all synchronized in one spot, right? So that's the idea of an RBVM platform like a Nucleus was so that you can keep all of that in sync. And because there are different reasons you will want to integrate with an Archer, there's a whole host of reasons. Some folks are managing a whole bunch of stuff in Archer, some folks just managing exception processes. And so it's going to depend on how your organization is structured specifically. But I think that might be all the ones in the chat. We answered the one about supply chain and SBOMs. We talked about Archer. We did the Sec DevOps stuff. Great. So looks like we're on to the actual Q&As. Looks like some Nucleus specific questions, mostly.
Yep.
Way to understand the true score of a vulnerability in an environment. For example, let's say there's an actively exploited RCE vulnerability. Okay, so can Nucleus see controls in place that may lower the severity? So this actually ties back into our GRC conversation from 30 seconds ago. So the question revolves around, hey, we have a vulnerability that may equal critical, but we have compensating controls in place. What do we do? So that's a core competency of Nucleus. That was the original reason we built Nucleus in the first place, was actually to be a wrapper around like a Tenable IO scanner. Actually, in those days, it was just Tenable SC, where we could take exceptions and we could say, hey, we have a compensating control in place. Here's what that compensating control is. Here's the impact on the risk. And so absolutely, that's a core use case for us, is we consider that part of the business context that we want to bring into the environment. Hopefully that answered your question. Obviously, happy to answer any of these questions as we go, later as well, set up separate times and those types of things. Custom findings. Let's talk about pen testing for a second, Tucker. How do you see in general pen testing work with VM programs?
It really depends. I mean, in our mature organizations, it's really brought into the VM platform as the same, into an RBVM tool or something similar with the findings. The biggest challenge that we see in most organizations struggle with is you have a team doing pen testing over here and you have your vulnerability management team, and they have no way to marry those findings together, because a lot of times the pen test findings aren't just CVEs or easily things consumable into a scanner. And so it's really a challenge that a lot of organizations face. Yeah,
that was one of the things that I was seeing as well from what we have, right? So one of the core things that you need to do is automated assessments and then also manual assessments. Those manual assessments can be anything from a pen test to a security review to a SOC 2 audit to anything that can generate findings, right? And so Jennifer, this is for you specifically around how we bring custom findings into Nucleus. We view that as just table stakes, right? So we want to aggregate and pull in all of the data from all of the different locations in an environment. So anything from custom findings to threat data to vulnerability data to asset information. So custom findings is just a core part of our platform. So you can manually add them one at a time, just like in a pen testing platform, like a Dratis or something like that. Or you can actually upload them in XML, CSV, or JSON schema and ingest them. We also have an assessments module inside of Nucleus so that you can upload them separately as a kind of a subset of your vulnerability data. And then once you've gone through the approval process, where it's like, we've delivered our assessment, here are the final results, you click a button and it gets merged into your larger vulnerability management program. So if you want more information about that, I'm sure we'll be happy to talk about that separately, but I didn't want this to be a Nucleus demo pitch. So, but I appreciate the questions and the interest. Looks like that might be all the questions. I think that might be it. I'm still waiting for feedback on what the best joke was.
I think we had one comment earlier that yours really hit home and mine was very punny, and they enjoyed both. So that's the only response that I think I saw.
All right, that works. I'll take that. I like this equity thing, right? One of us can't be funnier than the other. That's the only reason this works. And then, just the final thing here, if anybody is interested in more about Nucleus specifically, we do have a webinar coming up on April 11th. That's just a pure product demo. So if you're not interested, not in a buying cycle or whatever, no pressure, right? We're just here to provide information. Hopefully this was exciting though. We're more interested in making sure that this was valuable, and we would be very interested in any feedback that you have and making sure that we hit the mark. And, we'd like to provide more content like this over time. based on what we're seeing. We were very high level today, and I think over time it'd be really great to, if people are interested and we're continuing to see interest in these types of things, to start to pull out individual case studies and things that, again, not specifically Nucleus related, not specifically Deloitte related, but kind of anonymized and created based on what we're seeing as broader trends in the market. So we very much appreciate your time. And obviously, if you have any questions, reach out to either Tucker or myself. Tucker, I'm going to let you sign off, man. You get the last word as the honored guest.
I just want to say thanks everyone for joining and listening to Scott and I talk for an hour. And please reach out if you have any questions. Thanks, Scott, for hosting with me.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Tucker, thank you for being the guest, and I'll see all you guys soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
See everybody.